Over the months of August and September, Hot Topics will be following a series called Can Christians? In this series, Hot Topics will once again invite guests to hear from them on a range of somewhat taboo and controversial topics. In this series, we will not be prescribing specific answers to questions such as, can Christians have sex before marriage? Can Christians drink alcohol? Can Christians have a relationship with ancestors? Can Christians get tattoos? And many more. Instead, we will seek to explore these topics and equip you with the necessary tools to contemplate and respond ethically to taboo topics. Your host team for this series, Hloni Lepele, Rebecca Rivas, and Ilse Verle. This week on Hot Topics, Paul Verreyn will be joining us. Bishop Paul Verreyn is a Methodist minister in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa and also a former bishop of the Central Synod. Please welcome Paul Verreyn to tonight's Hot Topics conversation as we kick off the Can Christian series.
Warm greetings to everyone that is joining us for today's Hot Topics conversation. We are continuing with our new series. Well, I suppose it'll be new after this. Can Christians ... And today we're going to be speaking about, can Christians have sex before marriage? Now, as a youth pastor, before I hand over to everyone to really introduce themselves, but as a youth pastor, it's always an exciting topic because the one thing that always comes up when you have this conversation is, Hloni, what if I die without having sex? And so I'm always excited to chat about this particular topic. But just before we go into today's discussion, I'm just going to hand over to our panel and our co-hosts to just introduce themselves. Over to you.
Hey everyone, my name is Ilse and I'm part of the Hot Topics team.
Hello, I'm Paul, and I'm a visitor.
Hi everyone, I am Rebecca and I'm also part of the Hot Topics team. And I suppose it's good to say kind of where I'm coming from in this. So I am engaged and sex is definitely a topic that comes up often. So I'm looking forward to engaging on this topic.
Absolutely, man. So I think the first thing that really came up from my side, just looking at this particular topic, is the one thing that you always come across when you speak about sex before marriage within the context of the church, or sex outside of marriage to really broaden this whole conversation, is the church is old, it's boring, it's irrelevant, and it's always giving us stuff that no one can really live up to. I don't know.
I think definitely, I grew up in the church and always I was told sex before marriage is something that you don't do. And you never questioned it. It was just like the church says it's not okay, it's not okay. And I think especially also in youth ministry, you start to see that the new generations and the younger generations, they want to know why. They want to know how you got to that point. They don't want to just say the church says so or because the Bible said so. That's not good enough anymore. So today we kind of want to unpack what does that mean.
And I think that's the first thing we really just want to throw out there for our panel. Is the church old and boring in saying we should not have sex before marriage? Is it still relevant when most people are already having sex outside of marriage?
So, I think I agree with you because, statistics that have recently come out indicate that by far the majority, if not all people, before they are married, have sex. And if one then takes seriously what Jesus says about a lot of sex happens in your head, then it's definitely 100% of people who have sex before marriage. And you've heard Rebecca confess to that already in her introduction because she's engaged. And obviously, talk, think, imagine, sex. And so you would also know that sex doesn't happen without an imagination. It's not just that the little instruments of sex operate with a brain within themselves. Our entire bodies are connected when we engage one another in sex.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is so true. So my fiance and I, his name is Chris, we did a pre-marriage course. And in one of the weeks, it is speaking about what your expectations are as a couple as to how often you have sex and stuff like that. And I Chris always teases me all the time, and he says, I really don't know where you got your sex education, because it's so, like, you have no idea what's going on. Because it was such an awkward subject for me to approach, because I was so awkward around it. I was so like, well, should we be speaking about this? Should we be considering it? We're not married yet. I feel uncomfortable speaking about this before you're my husband. But actually, the truth is that we couldn't go through marriage prep without speaking about a very fundamental part of marriage. And I think maybe that's what isn't spoken about too much, is that sex wasn't designed as this optional extra. Sex was designed to make two people who were separate beings become one flesh, and that isn't controversial. That's beautiful. But unfortunately, it has become this controversial, unapproachable topic. And so, I don't know, in movies, they speak a lot about, when did your parents have the birds and the bees conversation with you, And my parents never had that conversation with me because sex was normalized. So it never got to this point where I came home and said, Mom, Dad, like, I heard this word, sex, because my parents, it wasn't taboo in my household to speak about, which it got taboo as I grew up, because of the church, because the church was so taboo about it, And so when Chris and I had to end up having this conversation, it must have been the most awkward 10 minutes of my life, because I sat there just thinking, like, I'm going to get struck down. The lightning is coming. So that's definitely the experience I've had with sex. And yeah, definitely, we've thought about it. I thought about it well before I was with Chris, So it is a normal thing and it's for women, actually, also, because women also were designed to have sex, So, yeah, I think that it has been taboo, and I've definitely experienced the awkwardness of sex.
I think it's definitely a taboo conversation that happens in the church, and at the same time, I feel that it's something that shouldn't be taboo. It's maybe the best place, as I said in last week, it's probably the best place to have these conversations is in the church, because if we're really going to believe that our ethics and our morals are informed by our faith, which I believe as a Christian should be, we need to have a grounding on almost every subject. And sex is something that, Paul, I think you hit it on the nail on the head, is that everyone at least thinks about it, whether you actually go and have the act of sex. But it's something that every person, I'm sure, has at some point in their life spoken about or thought about. And so just to come back to Cloney's question around our understanding of sex as the church, is it just old and boring, or where does it come from? What is the basis of our belief that sex before marriage is something that shouldn't happen?
We want to hear, would love to hear if it's biblical, because it's is it biblical? Where does it come from? It's where does the whole idea of no sex before marriage actually come from? I think it's a big question amongst youth.
Well, when you sent me the brief of this conversation, you don't know, but you gave me homework, because I've actually never scratched through the scriptures to try and find a proof text.
Exactly.
And one of the problems with proof texts is that they very often are used inaccurately. You with me? So the only, and I probably am going to be caught by some magnificent biblical scholar on this, but the only kind of hint that I could find was in Matthew chapter 2, when Mary was found to be with child, and she was betrothed to Joseph, and an angel came to him and said to him, don't divorce her, because it's not her fault that she's pregnant. It's actually the Holy Spirit that got her pregnant. Makes you think about the Holy Spirit. And so that kind of hints about the fact that there were, and I would like to suggest that they were cultural practices that became the norm around the issue of sex and marriage. And so it kind of hints at the fact that the ideal is that children should be conceived within an established relationship. Now let me say, there are all sorts of things here. Number one, that the raising of children ideally happens within a family with a father and a mother. And that the type of what makes a father and the type of what makes a mother is one of the most helpful things for the raising, or put it this way, the putting down of a stable relationship of love for the child. Now let me tell you that there are some mothers who really are fathers. They're far more masculine than their husbands are. And there are some men that are far more feminine than their wives are, if you want the typical typecast. But the importance is that the two seem to nurture children and generations well. Now let me come to one of the big problems that we face in South Africa. And I'll mention two. The first is that for child-headed households, the big psychological, social difficulties that you have to face in the raising of those children is who ultimately takes responsibility. Where does the buck stop? For the protection, for the feeding, for the clothing, for the educating, for all the things that make ultimately for what we imagine is a well-rounded adult. And because of the tragedy of AIDS deaths in this country, there are very few communities that don't have child-headed households. Even the issue of growing up with some sense of self, some sense of identity is also critical there. But people do not have that privilege. The second thing is that sometimes sex is over the treetops and can sometimes be, well, let me put it this way, irresponsible. And I say that carefully because it's not that simple to say this is irresponsible sex. But sometimes there is irresponsible sex. And then again, let me come back to the issue of children. Very often the woman ends up carrying the can, to be blunt. And so I come out of a single parent household. My brother-in-law, who was 17 years older than me, was a wonderful gift because my sister was 16 years older than me. So for a lot of my life, he really was the father figure in my home. And he was really a wonderful father figure. And then they didn't have children for the first 9 years of their marriage. So it was further complicated, and that was wonderful. But when, and let me call it bluntly for what it is, when sexism comes into the picture and the woman is seen as the baby bearer and must therefore take responsibility, that's also not acceptable. But one more thing I want to say is that women are not just there for having babies. And number two, men and women are not just there to have sex just for babies. You know what I mean? Sex is, dare I say this, more than just the factory for children. Sex is meant to develop the unique interaction between a man and a woman that can be ecstatically, dangerously exciting and must be made like that. So I would expect that a woman thinks, now what is really going to turn him on? And a man thinks, very responsibly, what is going to be exquisite for her in this experience? So that at the end of it, she doesn't just feel like a dirty rag that's slapped down on the table, but she walks away from the interaction of the sexual encounter with a fantastic sense of being alive, of being a human being, and of experiencing the most exquisite, one of the most exquisite gifts that God has given us. Then one last little thing. When St. Paul describes the relationship between the church and Christ, he actually uses the language of intimacy. The kind of intimacy that exists between a man and a woman. Now, I don't know whether I've answered the question, but I've tried to give some kind of context to where this culture has grown up in the church.
I think that it's so important. I think the word responsible is like such an important word to like cling on to in this context, where that sex can definitely, or there's been elements of sexual relationships that can be reckless and harmful. And I think maybe, this is just me spitballing, I think maybe that is why it is appropriate in the confines of marriage, is that it is a response, it can sometimes be reckless, but in marriage it's a responsible act, it's a responsible, I'm going to stick with the word act. But what actually I like the most about what you were speaking about, I care less, and someone will come at me for this, which is I'm okay with. I care less about sex before marriage, sex in marriage. I care less about the theology around it than I do about how women are perceived when they do have sex before marriage. That for me is actually more of the issue that I hold. I think that there is a theological argument that can be had about sex before marriage, and I probably do fall more on the conservative side of it, of yes, I do believe that things are more complicated if you're having sex outside of marriage, and that is a completely different, I guess it is this conversation, but I care less about the mechanics of sex, and what I care more about is how I've been a youth pastor before, I've been a middle school pastor before, I have been a campus pastor before, and there is one chronological link that I find, not chronological, that's a wrong word, but there's a link that I find everywhere, is women coming to me and feeling dirty or used or less than because they have engaged in sex outside of marriage, and being scared to speak to a pastor, being scared to speak to parents because they are worried that they are going to be seen as this used second-hand piece of meat almost. And I've had to counsel so many young girls through, Rebecca, I can't get married one day because my husband deserves better than someone who's had sex before, or I can't serve because I've had sex with my boyfriend. It's become this taboo topic that women can't, and I can only speak on behalf of women. I am sure men have also been seen as used and definitely judged by the church. But my experience has been far more that women have felt inadequate and just completely inadequate to serve because they have engaged in sex. And engage is even such a mechanical term, have had sex. And I think that there are worse things in the world, in the church, in the secular world, than whether you can serve because you've had sex, or whether you can serve because you haven't had sex, or because you've had this. Let's just look at, I'm so sorry, and I'm talking a lot. Let's look at Jesus and the confrontation that he has with the woman at the well. Okay, and I know we specifically were trying to steer clear of this, but what I'm trying to say is that Jesus is less concerned about the fact that she's sleeping with someone now who isn't her husband. He is more concerned with the fact that she's about to become an evangelist. he cares more about saying to her, you are loved, despite or in spite, whatever the correct English is, of your sexual history. Do you know what I mean? And despite how many people she's had sex with, she goes out and she converts a whole village. You know, Jesus is just less concerned with that.
Thank you for that. I think there's two things that I can kind of pick out coming out. You know, Rebecca, you speak about women, and Paul speaks about child-headed families and all of that stuff, that perhaps sex is something that, I mean, sex within the context of marriage protects us from various things that could happen, you know, when sex actually goes wrong. Now, just to go deeper into that, so I'll share my experience where I was first overwhelmed by God's love for me in a context of a Love Matters camp. Roman Catholic, sex before marriage camp. Not sex, a camp against sex before marriage.
It's a Freudian slip.
Where we even got purity rings. It was at Don Bosco Youth Camp Center. And because of that, sex before marriage became a very important part of my faith formation journey, because that's where I became overwhelmed by God's love. But what I then realized just growing up, as I grew up, is I struggled with this. I asked questions like, dude, I remember even saying to God, you know, what am I meant to do with all these feelings, you know? And yet there's this expectation that I'm going to abstain from sex before marriage. But I started understanding the whole idea of sex before marriage when I decided to let go of the idea of it being a Christian principle, and I took on it as a cultural principle from my Basotho culture. Then I could appreciate it better. Because I then began to understand what it's actually protecting me from. It was no longer this thing that God just looked at and hated and thought to himself, you shouldn't be thinking about that. But it was something that was protecting me from something. I want to now try to reconcile what you spoke about with the idea of social holiness. That in our conviction that there is no holiness without social holiness, that our understanding is that holiness should be impactful to a society, it should have an impact on society, it should have an impact of how things roll out in society in terms of child-headed families, in terms of everything that is attached to irresponsible sex. Can we ground it around that within a Methodist context? And say perhaps sex within the context of marriage as a responsible relationship is a way of transforming society so that we avoid everything that comes with irresponsible sex.
Sometimes, and this is risky, sometimes culture is problematic, as is Christianity. Are you with me? You know, so the worst case scenario is that you have a church that talks about all sorts of things, but never, ever, ever talks about sex. Because a lot of people don't like talking about sex because they think when they're talking about sex, they're having sex openly. You with me? So you've got to deal with a lot of old people who are very uncomfortable with their genitals. I'm sorry. They don't like saying the word vagina. They don't like saying the word penis. So they call them tollies and all sorts of other strange flowers and all this kind of nonsense. You with me? And we think that most of our young people above the age of 13 are really very stupid. And we think that they don't see that we think that they're stupid. So let me give you, talking about social holiness and talking therefore about justice at one level. Now, it's all very well to get into the dowries and the lobolas and those things. That's fine if you've got money. But what happens to a poor man who comes, and everything in the family is poor? There are no resources and cattle hidden away on a mountain somewhere to go and call on to come and pay for lobola. And so he struggles because he's very religious and he wants to, because a lot of people think that if you have sex before marriage, marriage, you're cursing God and all the rest of it. And particularly when you have very, very tight, fundamentalist, legalistic approaches to the whole thing. He falls desperately in love with a young woman. She's everything he could ever imagine. They create a relationship. They are responsible. They account to one another. They put everything in place for a very good marriage. And he recognizes that even in the culture, and it's not just in black culture, it's in white culture as well. We just are a little bit more hypocritical in the white culture around this kind of thing. But what happens is, shame, And I'll never forget what my mother said to me about this, and I'll come back to that. But he can't afford to get married. He just can't. Not because he's lazy, but because there are 6 million young people between the age of 19 and 25 in South Africa that are not employed and are probably never going to have a job. Now, what happens to them? Have they got to suck their thumbs and hope for some beneficiary to give them money to be able to meet the requirements? And it goes right across the cultures. I don't want my reasonably comfortable daughter, as I'm talking about a white, now to end up with somebody who's not going to be able to support her properly. But there are 6 million young people in this country, probably 3-4 million young men in this country, who, because of this culture, are not going to be able to be married. So the other thing I wanted to say, so I thought my mother was fairly prissy, and upright and Prussian and inflexible and scared of speaking about sex. And then one of my cousins fell pregnant before marriage. In fact, more than one. Makes me think about the rest of the family. And so she came and she told me that they were pregnant. And I said, let me tell you, if I had a daughter, now this is when I was about 12, 13, those judgmental, know all ages. I said, I want to tell you, if my daughter fell pregnant before marriage, I would chase her out of the house like a dog. And I'll never forget the look my mother gave me. She had these blue eyes with a brown spot in the one eye, and she looked at me directly, and it was one of the few times when she was more stern with me than at any other time. And she said to me, I want to tell you that if you did that, I would feel that my whole life was a failure, and I would be desperately disappointed in you. And then I want to say to you, I've been in a church where there were, people come to church. Often one doesn't think that what they're thinking about in church is sex. Yeah. But there's a lot of sex happening under the pews in the church, if you know what I mean. A hang of a lot of it. All the time. You understand? And some of it is legitimate and a lot of it is illicit. Fiddling a look here and a little poke around the corner and the rest of it. And so I had the women's manano come to me and say to me they wanted me to readmit some girls that had fallen in the young women's manano. Now, the regulation, and Sumilo is sitting over there, he'll nod his head, is that if you fall pregnant, you remove yourself from full membership. You're in actual fact censored. And just women. So I said to the woman's manana, no, by all means, I'm quite happy to readmit them to membership, but they've got to be readmitted with the boys who made the babies. Or did they make the babies like Mary and Joseph? So until the young men who have been suspended because they also were involved in making her pregnant are with her, they will not be censored. And they will not be admitted in public disgrace to everybody. They must come to communion and know that they must receive this gift with all the love of God that they can receive. Now, I know fundamentally that what I might be guilty of is undermining a culture. But we've got to be very careful, especially when we've been irresponsible as adults and not spoken about sex, or even had the first conversation with young men and young women about maybe you can have sex, but the church doesn't like the baby coming along, if that makes sense. I also want to say to you that women feel so disgraced. Sometimes men feel disgraced, but I haven't found it too often, that the quintessential place of receiving healing from the disgrace is the communion table. And so you talk about holiness. The church needs a good cleansing from all this hypocrisy.
Yeah, I had a friend last year. We were away. You know how church they like to go away on retreats. And we were on a retreat, and we were speaking about, we weren't even speaking about sex, but somehow we got into the topic of boyfriends. It was during our free time. We got on the topic of boyfriends, and she said to me, she was like, do you struggle? Like, do you and Chris struggle to not have sex? And I was like, of course, like, we are very attracted to each other, but it's not like, yeah, I mean, and I'm not ashamed of that. I'm very attracted to Chris, and of course, it is a struggle, and it is something that we both struggle with, and all my friends struggle with. It's not, and even now I'm quite awkward speaking about it, but it's actually the truth, is that you date someone, you marry someone that you're attracted to. The attraction doesn't start after you've said I do, it doesn't. And
Hallelujah.
Yeah, thank goodness. And I was talking to her about it, and she started crying. And she's also been in a long-term relationship, and she thought, Rebecca, I honestly thought I was the only person that found my boyfriend attractive and struggled with this not having sex thing. And I was like, you're definitely not the only person that has struggled with it. It is a daily struggle, and it is something that I'm quite passionate about, that we don't. It's quite difficult as a woman to be told your whole life, and actually as a man, you've been told your whole life, sex before marriage isn't good, sex before marriage isn't good, don't have sex before marriage, and then the whole thing comes, well, is oral sex, and is other things sex, and it's like all this. I remember I asked one of the youth pastors here, actually, is oral sex having sex? And this was their answer to me. Well, it has the word sex in it. And that was it. That was it. That was the only answer that I got. And I mean, I don't know. Anyway. But sorry, I was getting off track. And then all of a sudden you have this big white wedding, your father walks you down the aisle, you finished eating food, you go to your hotel room with your now husband, and now it's okay to have sex. So I've been told for 25 years, you can't have sex, you can't have sex. But then I have this massive celebration. I'm in this hotel room, and now my husband is expecting me to have sex with him, which is totally okay, because they've also been told this whole thing about sex before marriage, blah, blah, blah. And then you sit there, and you have sex with this, also happened to a friend of mine. You sit there, you have sex afterwards. She called me crying from her bathroom. She said, Rebecca, I feel disgusting. And I said, why? You married? And she said, but for 26 years, I've been told that it's not okay. But now all of a sudden I've said I do, and it's okay. And there's this dysmorphia that comes, right? Where it's like you have been this holy person your whole life, and now all of a sudden you're engaging in sex in a responsible way, but it doesn't feel responsible. It doesn't feel Now all of a sudden, and it's this whole thing. It's also this whole thing with the pregnancy. My gran sat me down when I was 15, and she said to me, Rebecca, if you ever fall pregnant, I will raise that baby. And so I definitely had a positive outlook on what would happen, and I knew my mom wouldn't kick me out. I know she wouldn't, but there was still this fear, and there still is this fear. And I'm 25 years old. I'm meant to be getting married in 10 days' time, and I still have this fear of sex,
Definitely. I think it's something I've also encountered as growing up, is the whole way that we as a church have taught about sex, I think can often lead people to that space where then they, in the context of marriage, have marital problems because of the whole way that they've been taught about sex. So to listen to what you said, Paul and Rebecca, my question is, how do we as a church responsibly teach about sex? That it's something that is beautiful, it is created by God, that it is to be engaged in responsibly, that it's instituted with the idea of creating families responsibly. But how do we do that and teach about sex without damaging the future relationships? How do we teach that boys and young girls don't feel that one day when they do have sex, they are damaged goods, or that when it's outside of marriage or even in marriage, that they feel, like Rebecca described, dirty, or that they've disappointed God? How do we engage this topic, that we still teach about engaging this idea of sex responsibly?
I just want to be very clear on something, just before we go on. And people will definitely disagree with me. I do believe that the best time to have sex is within the confines of marriage. I do believe that. It is something that and the reason why I believe that is because I've seen relationships that have had sex outside of marriage, and just so many more issues have been brought along with it. Because, not to get all spiritual, you have these soul ties, which also I hate the terminology of, but you do, and you almost imprint with this person, and I just wanted to make it clear that my stance is that I think that sex within marriage is a safer confines. But where I completely disagree with it is when you become dirty, you become defiled, it's almost like grace seems to cover a multitude of sins except the sin of sex. Grace doesn't see sex and homosexuality. It seems that grace almost runs out at those 2 points,
But
which is beyond. Sorry, my point is, right. Sorry, let me just wrap up before giving it to Paul and Tony. But I do think to have the conversation about sex as being designed by God, without having people completely have a hernia, hearing that sex was designed by God, I think that is the beginning of the conversation.
I think it's important, maybe just going back to Elsa's question, just to reconcile the 2 points, to say, so for instance, teachings I've came across is stuff like, I remember when we were at camp and this lady made everyone chew a bubble gum. And, was it everyone? Yeah, no, there's one person who chewed a bubble gum and then she put it into a bowl and then she asked the next person to take it. And the next person obviously refused. And she said, this is how it is when you have sex before marriage. You're asking your husband to take a bubble gum that someone has chewed on. And the problem with those kind of teachings is that they distort sex. Imagine you're a teenager and you're being taught that. But perhaps then, just to bring that question and reconcile it to what you said, because I think even with believing in that sex should happen within the context of marriage, you shouldn't blindly believe in it that it's just because it's marriage, but we should understand what's responsible for it to happen within the context of marriage. Exactly. And also engage other stuff that Paul even touches on, stuff like the commodification of cows, which is something that's very problematic, which is what makes lobola a problem, not lobola in principle. So also engage stuff like that. And then I would then ask, we believe that sex is good. I believe sex is good. I know the church believes that sex is good. I know that God creates human beings and he says they must be together and he says this is good. Pornhub also believes that sex is good. What is the difference between the two?
First of all, we need to recognize that sex is the decision that God has made for the continuation of our human being. So and this is very fundamentalist, but my imagination is this, that when the sperm meets the ovum, the decision of the beginning of new humanity, the work of the Spirit is there. That is and that's why sex is in actual fact a most sacred gift. Because it is, God's capable of making babies from anything, quite frankly, but it is his immovable decision that is the moment. So we've got to be fairly careful of how we tamper around with our judgments about people because I think that is essentially what God says to Joseph. Don't reject her, because I have been present. Now, just as we are skeptical around the virgin birth, and it's got all sorts of reasons theologically that make it hang together, we must clearly understand that it was one of a kind ever. And the God of all wisdom has decided that moment of almost illegitimacy should be the beginning of the new creation. So one's got to struggle with this judgmentalism that carries around with us in the exquisite gift that God has given us. Then I want to ask the controversial question. When is the point of marriage? You with me? Is it at the moment when a couple have matured in their relationship with one another to such an extent that they feel accountable to everybody? The relationship hasn't been hidden. The relationship has not been dishonest. People know about the thing that you're talking about. You understand? And they come to a place. Is it because there is a legal document that has been signed by the state? So is it actually the state that takes the place of God and says, I'm now, or is it the minister standing in front when you've gone through all the paraphernalia, 2 hours or 3 hours of premarital counseling? Is that what legitimizes? What really, in God's eyes, legitimizes the truth? When does God look at a relationship and say, I want to continue this wonderful race in this moment? And what is going on in God's mind? Now, this is the difficult one. When a man rapes a woman and she falls pregnant, what is grace for that child? What is grace for the perpetrator? What is grace for the survivor? What is grace? So the topic is profoundly nuanced. And I think we've got to walk as if we're on holy ground. We need to take off our shoes in this place.
Sure. Wow, thank you so much, Paul, for that. And I think that is where we're going to land it for today. You know, ending it with more questions than we had answers. I think just in 30 seconds, is there anything that anyone would like to say so that no one feels censored? 30 seconds? We're good. Okay, great. But I would love to invite you to join us for our Tuesday Bible study where we're going to be unpacking it further. And it might be a conversation that you're also interested in as a married couple because you're asking yourself questions around how am I going to get through around this with my children? Please do join us. Or you might even be a couple that's where you might have different views, you know, or it might be something that you're struggling with. But all I just want to encourage is join us as we continue with this discussion on Tuesday. But for today, thank you to everyone. This was really Holy God.